The Responsibility of Intellectuals. Noam Chomsky. Published in the New York Review of Books, February 23, 1967. 20 years ago, Dwight MacDonald published a series of articles in Politics on the responsibility of peoples and, specifically, the responsibility of intellectuals. I read them as an undergraduate in the years just after the war, and had occasion to read them again a few months ago. They seem to me to have lost none of their power or persuasiveness. MacDonald is concerned with the question of war guilt. He asks the question, to what extent were the German or Japanese people responsible for the atrocities committed by their governments? And, quite properly, he turns the question back to us. To what extent are the British or American people responsible for the vicious terror bombings of civilians, perfected as a technique of warfare by the Western democracies, and reaching their culmination in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, surely among the most unspeakable crimes in history? To an undergraduate in 1945 to 46, to anyone whose political and moral consciousness had been formed by the horrors of the 1930s, by the war in Ethiopia, the Russian Purge, the quote-unquote China incident, the Spanish Civil War, the Nazi atrocities, the Western reaction to these events, and, in part, complicity in them, these questions had particular significance and poignancy. With respect to the responsibility of intellectuals, there are still other, equally disturbing questions. Intellectuals are in a position to expose the lies of governments, to analyze actions according to their causes and motives and often hidden intentions. In the Western world, at least, they have the power that comes from political liberty, from access to information and freedom of expression. For a privileged minority, Western democracy provides the leisure, the facilities, and the training to seek the truth lying hidden behind the veil of distortion and misrepresentation, ideology, and class interest through which the events of current history are presented to us. The responsibilities of intellectuals, then, are much deeper than what MacDonald calls the, quote, responsibility of people, given the unique privileges that intellectuals enjoy. The issues that MacDonald raised are as pertinent today as they were 20 years ago. We can hardly avoid asking ourselves to what extent the American people bear responsibility for the savage American assault on a largely helpless rural population in Vietnam, still another atrocity in what Asians see as the, quote, Vasco da Gama era of world history. As for those of us who stood by in silence and apathy as this catastrophe slowly took shape over the past dozen years, on what page of history do we find our proper place? Only the most insensible can escape these questions. I want to return to them later on, after a few scattered remarks about the responsibility of intellectuals and how, in practice, they go about meeting this responsibility in the mid-1960s. It is the responsibility of intellectuals to speak the truth and to expose lies. This, at least, may seem enough of a truism to pass over without comment. Not so, however. For the modern intellectual it is not at all obvious. Thus we have Martin Heidegger writing in a pro-Hitler declaration of 1933 that, quote, truth is the revelation of that which makes a people certain, clear, and strong in its action and knowledge. It is only this kind of truth that one has a responsibility to speak. Americans tend to be more forthright. When Arthur Schlesinger was asked by the New York Times in November 1965 to explain the contradiction between his published account of the Bay of Pigs incident and the story he had given the press at the time of the attack, he simply remarked that he had lied. And a few days later, he went on to compliment the Times for also having suppressed information on the planned invasion in, quote, the national interest, as this term was defined by the group of arrogant and deluded men of whom Schlesinger gives such a flattering portrait in his recent account of the Kennedy administration. It is of no particular interest that one man is quite happy to lie in behalf of a cause which he knows to be unjust, but it is significant that such events provoke so little response in the intellectual community. For example, no one has said that there is something strange in the offer of a major chair in the humanities to a historian who feels it is to be his duty to persuade the world that an American-sponsored invasion of a nearby country is nothing of the sort. And what of the incredible sequence of lies on the part of our government and its spokesman concerning such matters as negotiations in Vietnam? The facts are known to all who care to know. The press, foreign and domestic, has presented documentation to refute each falsehood as it appears. But the power of the government's propaganda apparatus is such that the citizen who does not undertake a research project on the subject can hardly hope to confront government pronouncements with fact. The deceit and distortion surrounding the American invasion of Vietnam is by now so familiar that it has lost its power to shock. It is therefore useful to recall that although new levels of cynicism are constantly being reached, their clear antecedents were accepted at home with quiet toleration. It is a useful exercise to compare government statements at the time of the invasion of Guatemala in 1954 with Eisenhower's admission, to be more accurate, his boast, a decade later, that American planes were sent, quote, to help the invaders. New York Times, October 14, 1965. Nor is it only in moments of crisis that duplicity is considered perfectly in order. New frontiersmen, for example, have scarcely distinguished themselves by a passionate concern for historical accuracy, even when they are not being called upon to provide a, quote, propaganda cover for ongoing actions. For example, Arthur Schlesinger, New York Times, February 6, 1966, describes the bombing of North Vietnam and the massive escalation of military commitment in early 1965 as based on a, quote, perfectly rational argument. And here it is. So long as the Viet Cong thought they were going to win the war, they obviously would not be interested in any kind of negotiated settlement. The date is important. Had this statement been made 6 months earlier, one could attribute it to ignorance. But this statement appeared after the UN, North Vietnamese, and Soviet initiatives had been front-page news for months. It was already public knowledge that these initiatives had preceded the escalation of February 1965 and, in fact, continued for several weeks after the bombing began. Correspondents in Washington tried desperately to find some explanation for the startling deception that had been revealed. Chalmers Roberts, for example, wrote in the Boston Globe on November 19th with unconscious irony, late February 1965, hardly seemed to Washington to be a propitious moment for negotiations, since Mr. Johnson had just ordered the first bombing of North Vietnam in an effort to bring Hanoi to a conference table where the bargaining chips on both sides would be more closely matched. Coming at that moment, Schlesinger's statement is less an example of deceit than of contempt. Contempt for an audience that can be expected to tolerate such behavior with silence, if not approval. To turn to someone closer to the actual formation and implementation of policy, consider some of the reflections of Walt Rostow, a man who, according to Schlesinger, brought a, quote, spacious historical view to the conduct of foreign affairs in the Kennedy administration. According to his analysis, the guerrilla warfare in Indochina in 1946 was launched by Stalin, and Hanoi initiated the guerrilla war against South Vietnam in 1958. The view from the seventh floor, page 39 and 152. Similarly, the communist planners probed the free world spectrum of defense in northern Azerbaijan and Greece, where Stalin supported substantial guerrilla warfare, operating from plans carefully laid in 1945. And in Central Europe, the Soviet Union was not prepared to accept a solution which would remove the dangerous tensions from Central Europe at the risk of even slowly staged corrosion of communism in East Germany. It is interesting to compare these observations with studies by scholars actually concerned with historical events. The remark about Stalin's initiating the First Vietnamese War in 1946 does not even merit refutation. But even government sources concede that in 1959, Hanoi received the first direct reports of what Diem referred to as his own Algerian War, and that only after this did they lay their plans to involve themselves in this struggle. In fact, in December 1958, Hanoi made another of its many attempts, rebuffed once again by Saigon and the United States, to establish diplomatic and commercial relations with the Saigon government on the basis of the status quo. Rostow offers no evidence of Stalin's support for the Greek guerrillas. In fact, though the historical record is far from clear, it seems that Stalin was by no means pleased with the adventurism of the Greek guerrillas, who, from his point of view, were upsetting the satisfactory post-war imperialist settlement. Rostow's remarks about Germany are more interesting still. He does not see fit to mention, for example, the Russian notes of March to April 1952, which proposed unification of Germany under internationally supervised elections, with withdrawal of all troops within a year if there was a guarantee that a reunified Germany would not be permitted to join a Western military alliance. And he has also momentarily forgotten his own characterization of the strategy of the Truman and Eisenhower administrations, to avoid any serious negotiation with the Soviet Union until the West could confront Moscow with German rearmament within an organized European framework as a fait accompli. To be sure, in defiance of the Potsdam Agreements. But most interesting of all is Rostow's reference to Iran. The facts are that there was a Russian attempt to impose by force a pro-Soviet government in northern Azerbaijan that would grant the Soviet Union access to Iranian oil. This was rebuffed by superior Anglo-American force in 1946, at which point the more powerful imperialism obtained full rights to Iranian oil for itself with the installation of a pro-Western government. We recall what happened when, for a brief period in the early 1950s, the only Iranian government with something of a popular base experimented with the curious idea that Iranian oil should belong to the Iranians. What is interesting, however, is the description of northern Azerbaijan as part of the free world spectrum of defense. It is pointless by now to comment on the debasement of the phrase free world. But by what law of nature does Iran, with its resources, fall within Western dominion? The bland assumption that it does is most revealing of deep-seated attitudes toward the conduct of foreign affairs. In addition to this growing lack of concern for truth, we find, in recent published statements, a real or feigned naivete about American actions that reaches startling proportions. For example, Arthur Schlesinger, according to The Times, February 6, 1966, characterized our Vietnamese policies of 1954 as part of our general program of international goodwill. Unless intended as irony, this remark shows either a colossal cynicism or the inability on a scale that defies measurement to comprehend elementary phenomena of contemporary history. Similarly, what is one to make of the testimony of Thomas Schelling before the House Foreign Affairs Committee January 27, 1965, in which he discusses two great dangers if all Asia, quote, goes communist? First, this would exclude the United States and what we call Western civilization from a large part of the world that is poor and colored and potentially hostile. Second, a country like the United States probably cannot maintain self-confidence if just about the greatest thing it ever attempted, namely to create the basis for decency and prosperity and democratic government in the underdeveloped world, had to be acknowledged as a failure or as an attempt that we wouldn't try again. It surpasses belief that a person with even a minimal acquaintance with the record of American foreign policy could produce such statements. It surpasses belief, that is, unless we look at the matter from a more historical point of view, and place such statements in the context of the hypocritical moralism of the past. For example, of Woodrow Wilson, who was going to teach the Latin Americans the art of good government and who wrote, 1902, that it is our, quote, peculiar duty to teach colonial peoples order and self-control, and the drill and habit of law and obedience. Or of the missionaries of the 1840s, who described the hideous and degrading opium wars as, quote, the result of a great design of Providence to make the wickedness of men subserve his purposes of mercy toward China, in breaking through her wall of exclusion and bringing the empire into more immediate contact with Western and Christian nations. Or, to approach the present, of A. Burrell, who, in commenting on the Dominican intervention, has the impertinence to attribute the problems of the Caribbean countries to imperialism. Russian imperialism. As a final example of this failure of skepticism, consider the remarks of Henry Kissinger in his concluding remarks at the Harvard-Oxford television debate on America's Vietnam policies. He observed, rather sadly, that what disturbs him most is that others question not our judgment, but our motives. A remarkable comment by a man whose professional concern is political analysis. That is, analysis of the actions of governments in terms of motives that are unexpressed in official propaganda, and perhaps only dimly perceived by those whose acts they govern. No one would be disturbed by an analysis of the political behavior of the Russians, French, or Tanzanians questioning their motives and interpreting their actions by the long-range interests concealed behind their official rhetoric. But it is an article of faith that American motives are pure and not subject to analysis. Although it is nothing new in American intellectual history, or for that matter in the general history of imperialist apologia, this innocence becomes increasingly distasteful as the power it serves grows more dominant in world affairs, and more capable, therefore, of the unconstrained viciousness that the mass media present to us each day. We are hardly the first power in history to combine material interests, great technological capacity, and an utter disregard for the suffering and misery of the lower orders. The long tradition of naivete and self-righteousness that disfigures our intellectual history, however, must serve as a warning to the Third World, if such a warning is needed, as to how our protestations of sincerity and benign intent are to be interpreted. The basic assumptions of the new frontiersman should be pondered carefully by those who look forward to the involvement of academic intellectuals in politics. For example, I have referred above to Arthur Schlesinger's objections to the Bay of Pigs invasion, but the reference was imprecise. True, he felt that it was a terrible idea, but not because the notion of sponsoring an exile attempt to overthrow Castro seemed intolerable in itself. Such a reaction would be the merest sentimentality, unthinkable to a tough-minded realist. The difficulty, rather, was that it seemed unlikely that the deception could succeed. The operation, in his view, was ill-conceived but not otherwise objectionable. In a similar vein, Schlesinger quotes with approval Kennedy's quote-unquote realistic assessment of the situation resulting from Trujillo's assassination. I'm quoting, "There are three possibilities in descending order of preference: a decent democratic regime, a continuation of the Trujillo regime, or a Castro regime. We ought to aim at the first, but we really can't renounce the second until we are sure that we can avoid the third." The reason why the third possibility is so intolerable is explained a few pages later. Quote, "Communist success in Latin America would deal a much harder blow to the power and influence of the United States." Of course, we can never really be sure of avoiding the third possibility. Therefore, in practice, we will always settle for the second, as we are doing now in Brazil and Argentina, for example. Or consider Walt Rostow's view on American policy in Asia. The basis on which we must build this policy is that, quote, "we are openly threatened and we feel menaced by Communist China." To prove that we are menaced is, of course, unnecessary, and the matter receives no attention. It is enough that we feel menaced. Our policy must be based on our national heritage and our national interests. Our national heritage is briefly outlined in the following terms. Quote, "Throughout the 19th century, in good conscience, Americans could devote themselves to the extension of both their principles and their power on this continent, making use of the somewhat elastic concept of the Monroe Doctrine, and of course extending the American interest to Alaska and the mid-Pacific Islands. Both our insistence on unconditional surrender and the idea of post-war occupation represented the formulation of American security interests in Europe and Asia. So much for our heritage. As to our interests, the matter is equally simple. Fundamental is our profound interest that societies abroad develop and strengthen those elements in their respective cultures that elevate and protect the dignity of the individual against the state. At the same time, we must counter the ideological threat, namely the possibility that the Chinese communists can prove to Asians by progress in China that communist methods are better and faster than democratic methods. Nothing is said about those people in Asian cultures to whom our conception of the proper relation of the individual to the state may not be the uniquely important value, people who might, for example, be concerned with preserving the dignity of the individual against concentrations of foreign or domestic capital, or against semi-feudal structures such as Trujillo-type dictatorships introduced or kept in power by American arms. All of this is flavored with the allusions to our religious and ethical value systems and to our diffuse and complex concepts, which are to the Asian mind so much more difficult to grasp than Marxist dogma, and are so disturbing to some Asians because of their very lack of dogmatism. Such intellectual contributions as these suggest the need for a correction to de Gaulle's remark in his memoirs about the American will to power cloaking itself in idealism. By now, this will to power is not so much cloaked in idealism as it is drowned in fatuity. And academic intellectuals have made their unique contribution to this sorry picture. Let us, however, return to the war in Vietnam and the response that it has aroused among American intellectuals. A striking feature of the recent debate on Southeast Asian policy has been the distinction that is commonly drawn between quote-unquote responsible criticism on the one hand and sentimental or emotional or hysterical criticism on the other. There is much to be learned from a careful study of the terms in which this distinction is drawn. The hysterical critics are to be identified, apparently, by their irrational refusal to accept one fundamental political axiom, namely that the United States has the right to extend its power and control without limit insofar as is feasible. Responsible criticism does not challenge this assumption, but argues, rather, that we probably can't get away with it at this particular time and place. A distinction of this sort seems to be what Irving Kristol, for example, has in mind in his analysis of the protest over Vietnam policy. Encounter, August 1965. He contrasts the responsible critics, such as Walter Lippmann, The Times, and Senator Fulbright, with the teach-in movement. Unlike the university protesters, he points out, Mr. Lippmann engages in no presumptuous suppositions as to what the Vietnamese people really want. He obviously doesn't much care, or in legalistic exegesis as to whether or to what extent there is aggression or revolution in South Vietnam. His is a realpolitik point of view, and he will apparently even contemplate the possibility of a nuclear war against China in extreme circumstances. End of quote. This is commendable, and contrasts favorably for Kristol with the talk of the unreasonable ideological types in the teach-in movement, who often seem to be motivated by such absurdities as simple, virtuous anti-imperialism, who deliver harangues on the power structure, and who even sometimes stoop so low as to read articles and reports from the foreign press on the American presence in Vietnam. Furthermore, these nasty types are often psychologists, mathematicians, chemists, or philosophers, just as, incidentally, those most vocal in protest in the Soviet Union are generally physicists, literary intellectuals, and others remote from the exercise of power, rather than people with Washington contacts who, of course, realize that had they a new, good idea about Vietnam, they would get a prompt and respectful hearing in Washington. I am not interested here in whether Kristol's characterization of protest and dissent is accurate, but rather in the assumptions on which it rests. Is the purity of American motives a matter that is beyond discussion, or that is irrelevant to discussion? Should decisions be left to experts with Washington contacts, even if we assume that they command the necessary knowledge and principles to make the quote-unquote best decision, will they invariably do so? And a logically prior question, is expertise applicable, that is there a body of theory and of relevant information, not in the public domain, that can be applied to the analysis of foreign policy, or that demonstrates the correctness of present actions in some way that psychologists, mathematicians, chemists, and philosophers are incapable of comprehending? Although Kristol does not examine these questions directly, his attitude presupposes answers which are wrong in all cases. American aggressiveness, however it may be masked in pious rhetoric, is a dominant force in world affairs, and must be analyzed in terms of its causes and motives. There is no body of theory or significant body of relevant information beyond the comprehension of the layman which makes policy immune from criticism. To the extent that quote-unquote expert knowledge is applied to world affairs, it is surely appropriate, for a person of any integrity quite necessary, to question its quality and the goals it serves. These facts seem too obvious to require extended discussion. A corrective to Kristol's curious belief in the administration's openness to new thinking about Vietnam is provided by McGeorge Bundy in a recent issue of Foreign Affairs, January 1967. As Bundy correctly observes, on the main stage, the argument on Vietnam turns on tactics, not fundamentals, although, he adds, there are wild men in the wings. On stage center are, of course, the president, who in his recent trip to Asia had just quote-unquote magisterially reaffirmed our interest in the progress of the people across the Pacific, and his advisers, who deserve, quote, the understanding support of those who want restraint. It is these men who deserve the credit for the fact that, quote, the bombing of the North has been the most accurate and the most restrained in modern warfare, a solicitude which will be appreciated by the inhabitants, or former inhabitants, of Nam Dinh and Phu Lai and Vinh. It is these men, too, who deserve the credit for what was reported by Malcolm Brown as long ago as May 1965. I'm quoting, "In the South, huge sectors of the nation have been declared quote-unquote free bombing zones, in which anything that moves is a legitimate target. Tens of thousands of tons of bombs, rockets, napalm, and cannon fire are poured into these vast areas each week. If only by the laws of chance, bloodshed is believed to be heavy in these raids." Fortunately for the developing countries, Bundy assures us, American democracy has no taste for imperialism, and taken as a whole, the stock of American experience, understanding, sympathy, and simple knowledge is now much the most impressive in the world. It is true that 4/5 of all the foreign investing in the world is now done by Americans, and that the most admired plans and policies are no better than their demonstrable relation to the American interest. Just as it is true, so we read in the same issue of Foreign Affairs, that the plans for armed action against Cuba were put into motion a few weeks after Mikoyan visited Havana, quote, invading what had so long been an almost exclusively American sphere of influence. Unfortunately, such facts as these are often taken by unsophisticated Asian intellectuals as indicating a, quote, taste for imperialism. For example, a number of Indians have expressed their near exasperation at the fact that we have done everything we can to attract foreign capital for fertilizer plants, but the American and other Western private companies know we are over a barrel, so they demand stringent terms which we just cannot meet. Christian Science Monitor, November 26, while, quote, Washington doggedly insists that deals be made in the private sector with private enterprise. But this reaction, no doubt, simply reveals once again how the Asian mind fails to comprehend the diffuse and complex concepts of Western thought. It may be useful to study carefully the new, good ideas about Vietnam that are receiving a prompt and respectful hearing in Washington these days. The U.S. government printing office is an endless source of insight into the moral and intellectual level of this expert advice. In its publications one can read, for example, the testimony of Professor David N. Rowe, Director of Graduate Studies and International Relations at Yale University, before the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. Professor Rowe proposes that the United States buy all surplus Canadian and Australian wheat so that there will be mass starvation in China. These are his words. I'm quoting, "Mind you, I am not talking about this as a weapon against the Chinese people. It will be, but that is only incidental. The weapon will be a weapon against the government, because the internal stability of that country cannot be sustained by an unfriendly government in the face of general starvation." Professor Rowe will have none of the sentimental moralism that might lead one to compare this suggestion with, say, the Ostpolitik of Hitler's Germany. Nor does he fear the impact of such policies on other Asian nations, for example Japan. He assures us, from his very long acquaintance with Japanese questions, that the Japanese above all are people who respect power and determination. Hence, they will not be so much alarmed by American policy in Vietnam that takes off from a position of power, and intends to seek a solution based upon the imposition of our power upon local people that we are in opposition to. What would disturb the Japanese is a, quote, policy of indecision, a policy of refusal to face up to the problems in China and Vietnam and to meet our responsibilities there in a positive way, such as the way just cited. A conviction that we were unwilling to use the power that they know we have might alarm the Japanese people very intensely and shake the degree of their friendly relations with us. In fact, a full use of American power would be particularly reassuring to the Japanese because they have had a demonstration of the tremendous power in action of the United States because they have felt our power directly. This is surely a prime example of the healthy, realpolitik point of view that Irving Kristol so much admires. But, one may ask, why restrict ourselves to such indirect means as mass starvation? Why not bombing? No doubt this message is implicit in the remarks to the same committee of the Reverend R.J. de Jager, Regent of the Institute of Far Eastern Studies, Seton Hall University, who explains that like all people who have lived under communism, the North Vietnamese, quote, would be perfectly happy to be bombed to be free. Of course, there must be those who support the communists. But this is really a matter of small concern, as the Hon Walter Robertson, Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs from 1953 to 59, points out in his testimony before the same committee. He assures us that, quote, the Peiping regime represents something less than 3% of the population. Consider, then, how fortunate the Chinese communist leaders are, compared to the leaders of the Viet Cong who, according to Arthur Goldberg, New York Times, February 6, 1966, represent about, quote, 0.5% of the population of South Vietnam, that is, about 1/2 the number of new Southern recruits for the Viet Cong during 1965, if we can credit Pentagon statistics. In the face of such experts as these, the scientists and philosophers of whom Crystal speaks would clearly do well to continue to draw their circles in the sand. Having settled the issue of the political irrelevance of the protest movement, Crystal turns to the question of what motivates it. More generally, what has made statements in junior faculty, quote, go left, as he sees it, amid general prosperity and under liberal welfare state administrations. This, he notes, is a riddle to which no sociologist has as yet come up with an answer. Since these young people are well off, have good futures, etc., their protest must be irrational. It must be the result of boredom, of too much security, or something of this sort. Other possibilities come to mind. It may be, for example, that as honest men the students and junior faculty are attempting to find out the truth for themselves, rather than ceding the responsibility to quote-unquote experts or to government, and it may be that they react with indignation to what they discover. These possibilities Crystal does not reject. They are simply unthinkable, unworthy of consideration. More accurately, these possibilities are inexpressible. The categories in which they are formulated, honesty, indignation, simply do not exist for the tough-minded social scientist. In this implicit disparagement of traditional intellectual values, Crystal reflects attitudes that are fairly widespread in academic circles. I do not doubt that these attitudes are in part a consequence of the desperate attempt of the social and behavioral sciences to imitate the surface features of sciences that really have significant intellectual content. But they have other sources as well. Anyone can be a moral individual, concerned with human rights and problems, but only a college professor, a trained expert, can solve technical problems by sophisticated methods. Ergo, it is only problems of the latter sort that are important or real. Responsible, non-ideological experts will give advice on tactical questions. Irresponsible, ideological types will harangue about principle and trouble themselves over moral issues and human rights, or over the traditional problems of man and society, concerning which quote-unquote social and behavioral science has nothing to offer beyond trivialities. Obviously, these emotional, ideological types are irrational, since, being well off and having power in their grasp, they shouldn't worry about such matters. At times, this pseudoscientific posing reaches levels that are almost pathological. Consider the phenomenon of Herman Kahn, for example. Kahn has been both denounced as immoral and lauded for his courage. By people who should know better, his On Thermonuclear War has been described, quote, without qualification as one of the great works of our time. Stuart Hughes. The fact of the matter is that this is surely one of the emptiest works of our time, as can be seen by applying it to the intellectual standards of any existing discipline, by tracing some of its quote-unquote well-documented conclusions to the objective studies from which they derive, and following the line of argument where detectable. Kahn proposes no theories, no explanations, no factual assumptions that can be tested against their consequences, as do the sciences he is attempting to mimic. He simply suggests a terminology and provides a facade of rationality. When particular policy conclusions are drawn, they are supported by only ex cathedra remarks for which no support is even suggested, e.g., quote, the civil defense line probably should be drawn somewhere below $5 billion annually, end quote, to keep from provoking the Russians. Why not $50 billion? Or $5? What is more, Kahn is quite aware of this vacuity. In his more judicious moments, he claims only that, quote, there is no reason to believe that relatively sophisticated models are more likely to be misleading than the simpler models and analogies frequently used as an aid to judgment. For those whose humor tends towards the macabre, it is easy to play the game of quote-unquote strategic thinking a la Kant and to provide what one wishes. For example, one of Kant's basic assumptions is that, I'm quoting, an all-out surprise attack in which all resources are devoted to countervalue targets would be so irrational that, barring an incredible lack of sophistication or actual insanity among Soviet decision-makers, such an attack is highly unlikely. A simple argument proves the opposite. Premise 1. American decision-makers think along the lines outlined by Hermann Kahn. Premise 2. Kahn thinks it would be better for everyone to be red than for everyone to be dead. Premise 3. If the Americans were to respond to an all-out counter-value attack, then everyone would be dead. Conclusion. The Americans will not respond to an all-out counter-value attack, and therefore it should be launched without delay. Of course, one can carry the argument a step further. Fact. The Russians have not carried out an all-out counter-value attack. It follows that they are not rational. If they are not rational, there is no point in quote-unquote strategic thinking. Therefore... Of course, this is all nonsense, but nonsense that differs from Kahn's only in the respect that the argument is of slightly greater complexity than anything to be discovered in his work. What is remarkable is that serious people actually pay attention to these absurdities, no doubt because of the facade of tough-mindedness and pseudoscience. It is a curious and depressing fact that the quote-unquote anti-war movement falls prey all too often to similar confusions. In the fall of 1965, for example, there was an international conference on alternative perspectives on Vietnam, which circulated a pamphlet to potential participants stating its assumptions. The plan was to set up study groups in which 3 types of intellectual tradition will be represented. 1. Area specialists. 2. Social theory, with special emphasis on theories of the international system, of social change and development, of conflict and conflict resolution, or of revolution. 3. The analysis of public policy in terms of basic human values, rooted in various theological, philosophical, and humanist traditions. The second intellectual tradition will provide, quote, general propositions derived from social theory and tested against historical, comparative, or experimental data. The third will provide the framework out of which fundamental value questions can be raised and in terms of which the moral implications of societal actions can be analyzed. The hope was that, by approaching the questions of Vietnam policy from the moral perspectives of all great religions and philosophical systems, we may find solutions that are more consistent with fundamental human values than current American policy in Vietnam has turned out to be. In short, the experts on values, i.e., spokesmen for the great religions and philosophical systems, and the experts on social theory will provide general empirically validated propositions and, quote, general models of conflict. From this interplay, new policies will emerge, presumably from application of the canons of scientific method. The only debatable issue, it seems to me, is whether it is more ridiculous to turn to experts in social theory for general, well-confirmed propositions, or to the specialists in the great religions and philosophical systems for insights into fundamental human values. There is much more that can be said about this topic, but, without continuing, I would simply like to emphasize that, as is no doubt obvious, the cult of the experts is both self-serving, for those who propound it, and fraudulent. Obviously, one must learn from social and behavioral science whatever one can. Obviously, these fields should be pursued as seriously as possible. But it will be quite unfortunate and highly dangerous if they are not accepted and judged on their merits and according to their actual, not pretended, accomplishments. In particular, if there is a body of theory, well tested and verified, that applies to the conduct of foreign affairs or the resolution of domestic or international conflict, its existence has been kept a well-guarded secret. In the case of Vietnam, if those who feel themselves to be experts have access to principles or information that would justify what the American government is doing in that unfortunate country, they have been singularly ineffective in making this fact known. To anyone who has any familiarity with the social and behavioral sciences, or the policy sciences, the claim that there are certain considerations and principles too deep for the outsider to comprehend is simply an absurdity unworthy of comment. When we consider the responsibility of intellectuals, our basic concern must be their role in the creation and analysis of ideology. And in fact, Crystal's contrast between the unreasonable ideological types and the responsible experts is formulated in terms that immediately bring to mind Daniel Bell's interesting and influential The End of Ideology, an essay which is as important for what it leaves unsaid as for its actual content. Bell presents and discusses the Marxist analysis of ideology as a mask for class interest, quoting Marx's well-known description of the belief of the bourgeoisie that the special conditions of its emancipation are the general conditions through which alone modern society can be saved and the class struggle avoided. He then argues that the age of ideology is ended, supplanted, at least in the West, by a general agreement that each issue must be settled in its own terms, within the framework of a welfare state in which, presumably, experts in the conduct of public affairs will have a prominent role. Bell is quite careful, however, to characterize the precise sense of ideology in which ideologies are exhausted. He is referring to ideology only as the conversion of ideas into social levers, to ideology as a set of beliefs infused with passion which seeks to transform the whole of a way of life. The crucial words are transform and convert into social levers. Intellectuals in the West, he argues, have lost interest in converting ideas into social levers for the radical transformation of society. Now that we have achieved the pluralistic society of the welfare state, they see no further need for a radical transformation of society. We may tinker with our way of life here and there, but it would be wrong to try and modify it in any significant way. With this consensus of intellectuals, ideology is dead. There are several striking facts about Bell's essay. First, he does not point out the extent to which this consensus of the intellectuals is self-serving. He does not relate his observation that, by and large, intellectuals have lost interest in transforming the whole of a way of life to the fact that they play an increasingly prominent role in running the welfare state. He does not relate their general satisfaction with the welfare state to the fact that, as he observes elsewhere, America has become an affluent society, offering place and prestige to the one-time radicals. Secondly, he offers no serious argument to show that intellectuals are somehow right or objectively justified in reaching the consensus to which he alludes, with its rejection of the notion that society should be transformed. Indeed, although Bell is fairly sharp about the empty rhetoric of the quote-unquote new left, he seems to have a quite utopian faith that technical experts will be able to cope with the few problems that still remain. For example, the fact that labor is treated as a commodity, and the problems of alienation. It seems fairly obvious that the classical problems are very much with us. One might plausibly argue that they have even been enhanced in severity and scale. For example, the classical paradox of poverty in the midst of plenty is now an ever-increasing problem on an international scale. Whereas one might conceive, at least in principle, of a solution within national boundaries, a sensible idea of transforming international society to cope with vast and perhaps increasing human misery is hardly likely to develop within the framework of the intellectual consensus that Bell describes. Thus, it would seem natural to describe the consensus of Bell's intellectuals in somewhat different terms from his. Using the terminology of the first part of his essay, we might say that the welfare state technician finds justification for his special and prominent social status in his science, specifically in the claim that social science can support a technology of social tinkering on a domestic or international scale. He then takes a further step, ascribing in a familiar way a universal validity to what is in fact a class interest. He argues that the special conditions on which his claim to power and authority are based are, in fact, the only general conditions by which modern society can be saved. That social tinkering within a welfare state framework must replace the commitment to the quote-unquote total ideologies of the past, ideologies which were concerned with a transformation of society. Having found his position of power, having achieved security and affluence, he has no further need for ideologies that look to radical change. The scholar-expert replaces the free-floating intellectual who felt that the wrong values were being honored and rejected the society, and who has now lost his political role. Now, that is, that the right values are being honored. Conceivably, it is correct that the technical experts who will, or hope to, manage the quote-unquote industrial society will be able to cope with the classical problems without a radical transformation of society. It is conceivably true that the bourgeoisie was right in regarding the special conditions of its emancipation as the only general conditions by which modern society would be saved. In either case, an argument is in order, and skepticism is justified when none appears. Within the same framework of general utopianism, Bell goes on to pose the issue between welfare state scholar experts and third world ideologists in a rather curious way. He points out, quite correctly, that there is no issue of communism, the content of that doctrine having been long forgotten by friends and foes alike. Rather, he says, and I'm quoting, "The question is an older one, whether new societies can grow by building democratic institutions and allowing people to make choices and sacrifices voluntarily, or whether the new elites, heady with power, will impose totalitarian means to transform their societies." The question is an interesting one. It is odd, however, to see it referred to as an older one. Surely he cannot be suggesting that the West chose the democratic way. For example, that in England during the Industrial Revolution, the farmers voluntarily made the choice of leaving the land, giving up cottage industry, becoming an industrial proletariat, and voluntarily decided, within the framework of the existing democratic institutions, to make the sacrifices that are graphically described in the classic literature on 19th century industrial society. One may debate the question whether authoritarian control is necessary to permit capital accumulation in the underdeveloped world, but the Western model of development is hardly one that we can point to with any pride. It is perhaps not surprising to find Walt Rostow referring to the more humane processes of industrialization that Western values would suggest, an American policy in Asia. Those who have a serious concern for the problems that face backward countries and for the role that advanced industrial societies might, in principle, play in development and modernization, must use somewhat more care in interpreting the significance of the Western experience. Returning to the quite appropriate question whether new societies can grow by building democratic institutions or only by totalitarian means, I think that honesty requires us to recognize that this question must be directed more to American intellectuals than to third world ideologists. The backward countries have incredible, perhaps insurmountable problems and few available options. The United States has a wide range of options, and has the economic and technological resources, though, evidently, neither the intellectual nor moral resources, to confront at least some of these problems. It is easy for an American intellectual to deliver homilies on the virtues of freedom and liberty, but if he is really concerned about, say, Chinese totalitarianism or the burdens imposed on the Chinese peasantry in forced industrialization, then he should face a task that is infinitely more important and challenging, the task of creating, in the United States, the intellectual and moral climate, as well as the social and economic conditions that would permit this country to participate in modernization and development in a way commensurate with its material wealth and technical capacity. Large capital gifts to Cuba and China might not succeed in alleviating the authoritarianism and terror that tend to accompany early stages of capital accumulation, but they are far more likely to have this effect than lectures on democratic values. It is possible that even without, quote, capitalist encirclement in its various manifestations, the truly democratic elements in revolutionary movements, in some instances Soviets and collectives, might be undermined by an elite of bureaucrats and technical intelligentsia. But it is almost certain that capitalist encirclement itself, which all revolutionary movements now have to face, will guarantee this result. The lesson, for those who are concerned to strengthen the democratic, spontaneous, and popular elements in developing societies, is quite clear. Lectures on the two-party system, or even on the really substantial democratic values that have been in part realized in Western society, are a monstrous irrelevance, given the effort required to raise the level of culture in Western society to the point where it can provide a, quote, social lever for both economic development and the development of true democratic institutions in the Third World, and, for that matter, at home. A good case can be made for the conclusion that there is indeed something of a consensus among intellectuals who have already achieved power and affluence, or who sense that they can achieve them by, quote, accepting society as it is and promoting the values that are, quote, being honored in this society. It is also true that this consensus is most noticeable among the scholar experts who are replacing the free-floating intellectuals of the past. In the university, these scholar experts construct a, quote, value-free technology for the solution of technical problems that arise in contemporary society, taking a responsible stance towards these problems in the sense noted earlier. This consensus among the responsible scholar experts is the domestic analog to that proposed internationally by those who justify the application of American power in Asia, whatever the human cost, on the grounds that it is necessary to contain the, quote, expansion of China, an expansion which is, to be sure, hypothetical for the time being. That is, to translate from State Department newspeak, on the grounds that it is essential to reverse the Asian nationalist revolutions or, at least, to prevent them from spreading. The analogy becomes clear when we look carefully at the ways in which this proposal is formulated. With his usual lucidity, Churchill outlined the general position in a remark to his colleague of the moment, Joseph Stalin, at Tehran in 1943. I'm quoting, "The government of the world must be entrusted to satisfied nations, who wished nothing more for themselves than what they had. If the world government were in the hands of hungry nations, there would always be danger. But none of us had any reason to seek for anything more. Our power placed us above the rest. We were like the rich men dwelling at peace within their habitations." For a translation of Churchill's biblical rhetoric into the jargon of contemporary social science, one may turn to the testimony of Charles Wolfe, senior economist of the Rand Corporation, at the Congressional Committee hearings cited earlier. I'm quoting, "I am dubious that China's fears of encirclement are going to be abated, eased, relaxed in the long-term future. But I would hope that what we do in Southeast Asia would help to develop within the Chinese body politic more of a realism and willingness to live with this fear than to indulge it by support for liberation movements, which admittedly depend on a great deal more than external support. The operational question for American foreign policy is not whether that fear can be eliminated or substantially alleviated, but whether China can be faced with a structure of incentives, of penalties and rewards, of inducements that will make it willing to live with this fear." The point is further clarified by Thomas Schelling. Quote, "There is growing experience, which the Chinese can profit from, that although the United States may be interested in encircling them, may be interested in defending nearby areas from them, it is nevertheless prepared to behave peaceably if they are. In short, we are prepared to live peaceably in our, to be sure, rather extensive, habitations. And, quite naturally, we are offended by the undignified noises from the servants' quarters. If, let us say, a peasant-based revolutionary movement tries to achieve independence from foreign powers and the domestic structures they support, or if the Chinese irrationally refuse to respond properly to the schedule of reinforcement that we have prepared for them, if they object to being encircled by the benign and peace-loving, quote, rich men who control the territories on their borders as a natural right, then, evidently, we must respond to this belligerence with appropriate force." It is this mentality that explains the frankness with which the United States government and its academic apologists defend the American refusal to permit a political settlement in Vietnam at a local level, a settlement based on the actual distribution of political forces. Even government experts freely admit that NLF is the only, quote, truly mass-based political party in South Vietnam, that the NLF had, quote, made a conscious and massive effort to extend political participation, even if it was manipulated, on the local level so as to involve the people in a self-contained, self-supporting revolution, and that this effort had been so successful that no political groups, with the possible exception of the Buddhists, thought themselves equal in size and power to risk entering into a coalition, fearing that if they did, the whale would swallow the minnow. Moreover, they concede that until the introduction of overwhelming American force, the NLF had insisted that the struggle, quote, should be fought out at the political level, and that the use of massed military might was in itself illegitimate. The battleground was to be the minds and loyalties of the rural Vietnamese. The weapons were to be ideas. And, correspondingly, that until mid-1964, aid from Hanoi, quote, was largely confined to two areas, doctrinal know-how and leadership personnel. Captured NLF documents contrast the enemy's, quote, military superiority with their own, quote, political superiority, thus fully confirming the analysis of American military spokesmen who define our problem as how, quote, with considerable armed force but little political power, to contain an adversary who has enormous political force but only modest military power. Similarly, the most striking outcome of both the Honolulu Conference in February and the Manila Conference in October was the frank admission by high officials of the Saigon government that they could not survive a peaceful settlement that left the Viet Cong political structure in place even if the Viet Cong guerrilla units were disbanded, that, quote, they are not able to compete politically with the Vietnamese communists. Thus, Moore continues, the Vietnamese demand a pacification program which will have as its core the destruction of the clandestine Viet Cong political structure and the creation of an iron-like system of government political control over the population. And from Manila, the same correspondent, on October 23rd, quotes a high South Vietnamese official as saying that, frankly, we are not strong enough now to compete with the communists on a purely political basis. They are organized and disciplined. The non-communist nationalists are not. We do not have any large, well-organized political parties, and we do not yet have unity. We cannot leave the Viet Cong in existence. Officials in Washington understand the situation very well. Thus, Secretary Rusk has pointed out that, quote, if the Viet Cong come to the conference table as full partners, they will, in a sense, have been victorious in the very aims that South Vietnam and the United States are pledged to prevent. Max Frankel reported from Washington in the Times on February 18, 1966, that compromise has had no appeal here because the administration concluded long ago that the non-communist forces of South Vietnam could not long survive in a Saigon coalition with communists. It is for that reason, and not because of an excessively rigid sense of protocol, that Washington has steadfastly refused to deal with the Viet Cong or recognize them as an independent political force. In short, we will, magnanimously, permit Viet Cong representatives to attend negotiations only if they agree to identify themselves as agents of a foreign power and thus forfeit the right to participate in a coalition government, a right which they have now been demanding for a half-dozen years. We well know that in any representative coalition, our chosen delegates could not last a day without the support of American arms. Therefore, we must increase American force and resist meaningful negotiations, until the day when a client government can exert both military and political control over its own population, a day which may never dawn, for as William Bundy has pointed out, we could never be sure of the security of a Southeast Asia from which the Western presence was effectively withdrawn. Thus, if we were to, quote, negotiate in the direction of solutions that are put under the label of neutralization, this would amount to capitulation to the communists. According to this reason, then, South Vietnam must remain, permanently, an American military base. All of this is, of course, reasonable so long as we accept the fundamental political axiom that the United States, with its traditional concern for the rights of the weak and downtrodden, and with its unique insight into the proper mode of development for backward countries, must have the courage and the persistence to impose its will by force, until such time as other nations are prepared to accept these truths, or simply to abandon hope. If it is the responsibility of the intellectual to insist upon the truth, it is also his duty to see events in their historical perspective. Thus one must applaud the insistence of the Secretary of State on the importance of historical analogies, the Munich analogy, for example. As Munich showed, a powerful and aggressive nation with a fanatic belief in its manifest destiny will regard each victory, each extension of its power and authority, as a prelude to the next step. That matter was very well put by Adlai Stevenson when he spoke of, quote, the old route whereby expansive powers push at more and more doors, believing they will open until, at the ultimate door, resistance is unavoidable and a major war breaks out. Herein lies the danger of appeasement, as the Chinese tirelessly point out to the Soviet Union, which they claim is playing Chamberlain to our Hitler in Vietnam. Of course, the aggressiveness of liberal imperialism is not that of Nazi Germany, though the distinction may seem academic to a Vietnamese peasant who is being gassed or incinerated. We do not want to occupy Asia. We merely wish, to return to Mr. Wolf, to help the Asian countries progress toward economic modernization as relatively open and stable societies to which our access, as a country and as individual citizens, is free and comfortable. The formulation is appropriate. Recent history shows that it makes little difference to us what form of government a country has, so long as it remains an open society, quote-unquote, in our peculiar sense of the term. That is, a society that remains open to American economic penetration or political control. If it is necessary to approach genocide in Vietnam to achieve this objective, then this is the price we must pay in defense of freedom and the rights of man. In pursuing the aim of helping other countries to progress toward open societies, with no thought of territorial aggrandizement, we are breaking no new ground. In the congressional hearings that I cited earlier, Hans Morgenthau aptly describes our traditional policy towards China as one which favors, quote, what you might call freedom of competition with regard to the exploitation of China. In fact, few imperialist powers have had explicit territorial ambitions. Thus, in 1784, the British Parliament announced, "To pursue schemes of conquest and extension of dominion in India are measures repugnant to the wish, honor, and policy of this nation." Shortly after this, the conquest of India was in full swing. A century later, Britain announced its intentions in Egypt under the slogan, "Intervention, Reform, Withdrawal." It is obvious which parts of this promise were fulfilled within the next half-century. In 1936, on the eve of hostilities in North China, the Japanese stated their basic principles of national policy. These included the use of moderate and peaceful means to extend her strength, to promote social and economic development, to eradicate the menace of communism, to correct the aggressive policies of the great powers, and to secure her position as the stabilizing power in East Asia. Even in 1937, the Japanese government had, quote, no territorial designs upon China. In short, we follow a well-trodden path. It is useful to remember, incidentally, that the U.S. was apparently quite willing, as late as 1939, to negotiate a commercial treaty with Japan and arrive at a modus vivendi if Japan would change her attitude and practice towards our rights and interests in China, as Secretary Hull put it. The bombing of Chongqing and the rape of Nanking were unpleasant, it is true, but what was really important was our rights and interests in China, as the responsible, unhysterical men of the day saw quite clearly. It was the closing of the open door by Japan that led inevitably to the Pacific War, just as it is the closing of the door by Communist China itself that may very well lead to the next, and no doubt last, Pacific War. Quite often, the statements of sincere and devoted technical experts give surprising insight into the intellectual attitudes that lie in the background of the latest savagery. Consider, for example, the following comment by the economist Richard Lindholm in 1959, expressing his frustration over the failure of economic development in quote-unquote free Vietnam. I'm quoting, "The use of American aid is determined by how the Vietnamese use their incomes and their savings. The fact that a large portion of the Vietnamese imports financed with American aid are either consumer goods or raw materials used rather directly to meet consumer demands is an indication that the Vietnamese people desire these goods, for they have shown their desire by their willingness to use their piastres to purchase them. In short, the Vietnamese people desire Buicks and air conditioners, rather than sugar refining equipment or road building machinery, as they have shown by their behavior in a free market. And however much we may deplore their free choice, we must allow the people to have their way. Of course, there are also those two-legged beasts of burden that one stumbles on in the countryside, but as any graduate student of political science can explain, they are not part of a responsible modernizing elite, and therefore have only a superficial biological resemblance to the human race. In no small measure, it is attitudes like this that lie behind the butchery in Vietnam, and we had better face up to them with candor, or we will find our government leading us towards a quote-unquote final solution in Vietnam and in the many Vietnams that inevitably lie ahead. Let me finally return to Dwight MacDonald and the responsibility of intellectuals. MacDonald quotes an interview with a death camp paymaster who burst into tears when told that the Russians would hang him. "Why should they? What have I done?" he asked. MacDonald concludes, quote, "Only those who are willing to resist authority themselves when it conflicts too intolerably with their personal moral code, only they have the right to condemn the death camp paymaster." The question, "What have I done?" is one that we may well ask ourselves, as we read each day of fresh atrocities in Vietnam, as we create or mouth or tolerate the deceptions that will be used to justify the next defense of freedom. This has been The Responsibility of Intellectuals by Noam Chomsky, published in the New York Review of Books, February 23, 1967.